Hi everyone, thanks for joining Digital Dragons. I hope you've been enjoying the content so far. There's been some fantastic sessions. I'm John, I'm the VP of Publishing here at BoomBit. And today I'm really excited to be sharing with you my thoughts on hyper-casual games. It's a fantastic industry to work in. There is so much incredible developer talent around the world. It's what we get up for every morning, because you never know which developer you're going to find in which part of the world with that incredible idea that's going to unlock the next hit. So today I'm going to talk to you about sort of how to win. There is a very simple formula to some parts of hyper-casual, for sure. I don't want to take away from the sort of creative genius of a lot of the developers, but there are some basic elements that developers really need to know and follow to succeed. We'll also share with you some thoughts on the testing process, game design, some trends, and also just some thoughts on where we think hyper-casual games is going, and look forward to your questions as we go. So for those of you that don't know BoomBit, or perhaps you know us in different game genres, I just wanted to give you a really brief history about BoomBit. So we were actually in free-to-play games back in 2014, before hyper-casual was even a phrase. Had sort of 40+ games. For those of you that remembers Dancing Line, we published with Cheetah with 120 million downloads. We then set off on our journey into mid-core games with Tiny Gladiators, Idle with the great team at Starbury Games, with Idle Coffee Corp, Tanks a Lot with High Core. And then in 2019, our two CEOs led us through our IPO in Poland. And then Q4 last year, we decided to start moving back to our roots in the hyper-casual space, but bringing all of our knowledge from mid-core, from IP-based games, and started the team focusing on some great games that we're going to share some of these today, like Ramp Car Jump, Will It Shred, more recently Slingshot. And we're really excited to be part of the hyper-casual scene now. But as I'm going to come on to, we at BoomBit are taking a slightly different approach, given our expertise in things like live ops, A/B testing, BI, which have been built around several years in different game genres. So we're bringing that into what is currently hyper-casual, but we'll come on to talk about what that may look like later. A little bit on about how we've been doing. So purely from our hyper-casual game portfolio this year to date, we've had 100 million downloads already. Ramp Car Jump has been our biggest success that you can see here. Hopefully you've played it. That's had 35 million downloads. But right now, our latest game, Slingshot, we are anticipating that's going to surpass Ramp Car Jump. So here you go. I hope you've played it. It's still very much for us in soft launch. Not that we like to use that word in hyper-casual, more of a mid-core term. But this is with a great studio here, Tap Nice. And a little bit on our publishing model, and we're going to go into this in more detail. The basics: test quickly before investing in prototypes. Transparency, we're big believers in ensuring our developers know where we're testing, how we're testing, providing them all the data, so that if we decide to kill an idea, you understand why. We're all about providing dedicated teams to our developers, right? It's not just about UA and monetization. UX, UI, do you need a solutions engineer to help integrate a monetization SDK? Do you need one of our artists? We have 200 people here in Gdansk. And I'd say the biggest difference here at BoomBit is we focus on profitability and ARPU, right? And I'm going to talk about this later in terms of some advice for developers. You need to decide what's more important to you. Chart position is always great, hit number 1, hit top 10, but there's a cost to that. There's a hidden cost to that versus, would you rather have a check for $1 million and actually a game that's highly profitable? So our focus is 100% on ARPU. So just to kind of recap, I know there's a mix of developers listening right now, some that are at the beginning of their journey, some that are perhaps at a later stage, maybe already had some hit games, but I just want to summarize some of the basics. So this is really a recurring theme, and if you can put this on your wall in your studio, please do. But Hyper-casual success is all about simplicity, right? You need to remember the audience and who we're building games for. We're not building games for you and your team to sit there and say, hey, this is a great game. We're building this for a global wide audience, right? Anywhere from your daughter, your niece, your nephew, to your grandparents, right? That is how broad we are talking about in terms of this audience. It's not a core RPG audience where there's a very clear demographic, maybe a certain more male skew, certain age. This is a very wide-ranging audience, generally sort of 50-50 male-female. Of course, there is a sweet spot in terms of age, maybe 16 to 40, but you need to bear that in mind when you're building your game, right? Because if a 6-year-old can't understand it, or your grandparents can't understand it, it's probably too difficult. So really keep that in mind when you're developing everything, you know, from your first CTR test, your idea, right? The other thing I'll say here is, yes, it sounds odd to be saying this, talking about gaming, but hyper-casual games are content, right? They're not necessarily games as we know them. Some, you know, I'm sure you've played an ultra-casual game, and you don't really think you're even playing a game, right? You're icing a cake, you're making a pancake. So the people playing these games, they don't identify as gamers, right? They don't think of themselves as, yeah, I'm a gamer. They are just using hyper-casual games as a really nice way of entertainment, of filling some time. So throughout the whole stage of your development, just never lose sight of your target audience. What are some of the basic elements? I know this has been discussed at length at many conferences, but again, it amazes me that when you see CTR videos or prototypes, some of these are just not there, right? So an endless core loop, what does that mean? Well, really, each level, it's kind of the same gameplay. It's repetitive. You're not having to build 100 unique levels. The game could literally go on and on to level 500, level 1000. Really hard to fail, right? You don't want games to be punitive. You just want the player to feel good. If they feel good and they get that, that nice shot of endorphins, they're going to feel really great and want to play your game even more. So make sure it's really hard to fail. A really flat learning curve, right? You ideally should be able to play with one finger. I know there's some more complex games now that are maybe playing around with using more than one finger or both hands, but if you can't play the game with one finger, it's too difficult. In terms of the platforms to use, of course, Unity for a long time has been the default, but there's a general no-code movement now in all of software, and I would encourage you to also look at the BuildBox platform. I know a lot of publishers won't work with developers that develop on BuildBox, but from a BoomBit perspective, so long as you integrate our SDK, we will fully support the BuildBox community. And generally build in 3D as well. 2D, it's kind of niche now. I think early on it was fine, but really you want to build in 3D. When you're testing, I'm not saying you want to build Sonic the Hedgehog. It was more a gentle nod to Sonic Speed, but you want to test really, really quickly, okay? If it's taking you 2 to 3 weeks to build some CTR videos, that's too slow. If it's taking you a month to build a prototype, unless it's a really complex game with a really deep meta, it's too slow, right? So to give you some guidelines and to give you some insight from developers around the world and really what the gold standard looks like, you want to be building a prototype. So a definition of a prototype for this conversation would be 10 minutes of gameplay. You need to be doing that in around 5 days, okay? And there's a simple reason for that on your screen right now, and it's because of copycats, right? There's many great things about hyper-casual, but it's a competitive industry. There's a lot of tools out there. As soon as you publish your game on iOS, everyone can see it, right? Every time you make an update to that game, everyone can see it. So if you've got a really interesting game or concept that you've maybe spent 6 weeks developing and you want to start getting some users and get some learnings, if it's a great game, there are studios, publishers around the world that are going to see it and they're going to run a marketability test, and very quickly they could have your game out, but maybe a slightly better version in a day, 2-3 days. So I'm not saying that to discourage you. I just think it's really important when developers enter hyper-casual they, you know, don't follow the rainbow and think they're going to get this pot of the gold at the end. This is why speed is really, really important, because if you're onto a really great idea, other people will see it. So you need to be testing and building your prototypes and moving through that publishing process as quickly as possible. The other key thing is hyper-casual games. There's so many genres now, okay? So remember this really big, broad audience. It's not just one type of game, right? And I've just given you some examples here, right? You've got ultra casual ASMR game. For me, these are the real entry-level games for hyper-casual. So generally super, super low CPI, which make the game as scalable as possible to be able to hit as broad an audience as possible. But generally, the LTV on these games are pretty poor, right? Because they're not the kind of game you're going to be playing for, you know, beyond, you know, let's say maybe a day for argument's sake, or a number of minutes. Generally, the art style is quite low, but they're incredibly addictive games. Role play, we're seeing a lot of these right now. So this is Drive Through from the great team at Rollick. Again, very simple formula. It's taking something from everyday life, in this instance, a drive-through. Usually there's at least 2 or 3 steps per level that you need to do. So, you know, making a burger and checking out. Action, these are this is a really great category, and I'll talk about this later, but generally, let's say compared to ultra casual games, action games, you can look for a higher CPI because your LTV is going to be a lot higher. You've got puzzle games. For me, this is quite an underserved category in hyper-casual, also because it's actually quite difficult to do, to take the complexity of, let's say, a physics-based casual puzzle game and simplify that down for the hyper-casual audience. But, you know, there's some great games out there right now. And as hyper-casual has grown, what I've enjoyed seeing is these sort of like, you know, audience or subject-based games. So there's a few examples here. You know, at BoomBit, you'll probably notice on our account, we're very, very strong at car auto-based games, and we've had 2, 3 very big hits here. Whereas historically for hyper-casual, you wouldn't just go out and set about building a car game, right? You're just trying to build a nice piece of content for a broad audience. So we're definitely seeing that theme emerging, where there's certain studios or publishers now very strong at a certain type of hyper-casual game, because, you know, some of the game design, gameplay is unique, but also, you know, the UA monetization is starting to look a little different depending on the audience. Or for example, you know, fashion-based games, again, go against the rule of thumb for hyper-casual because you want to hit a really broad male-female audience, whereas, you know, clearly fashion-based games skew more heavily towards female, that traditionally would skyrocket the CPI. But again, with the right team, UA team, we're starting to see these, you know, fashion female-based games working well in hyper-casual. So I've already spoken about the testing process. I want to go into that in a bit more detail now to guide you through that. So the golden rule here is test early. Your time, your studio's time, your developers, designers' time, it costs money, right? And unlike other perhaps game genres and learning from, you know, what we've seen in mid-core RPG, you really want to just start as super early as possible, right? As soon as you've got an idea, come up with a really nice, simple 15-second video that you can run a CTR test. You ideally want, you know, 3 to 5 videos. These are not high level on art. You're just testing the core mechanic to see if your idea has got any scale to it. And those first 1 to 3 seconds in those videos that you put out are really, really key, right? Can I come back to my original comment about the audience, keep it simple? Do I understand the concept of the game in those first 3 seconds? Otherwise, I'm probably not going to click on your, video. Include really basic instructions on how to play and some encouragement. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples, but again, just make it really simple. Remember, this audience are not gamers, so a nice little finger on the screen, little arrows in terms of where they need to move, how they need to move. Don't just assume it's obvious to you, because if you think it's obvious to you, I can promise you it won't be obvious to the hyper-casual audience. And again, don't worry about creative, and as per my earlier point, you know, Unity build box and make sure it's in 3D. So just a couple of examples from our game Slingshot that I'm just going to share with you. I'm going to mute myself just while the sound plays or doesn't play. So that's the first thing I'll share with you. And there's different creatives that work quite well. So obviously that's one scenario that for your audience looks like, you know, what does winning look like versus what does failing look like. And generally we see these sort of fail videos, as we call them, can deliver better CTR. Here's another version. So slightly different route there. You know, we were playing around with, you know, almost more like cinematic AAA quality, but still very fairly representing the game. And this is an important point here. When you work with publishers, make sure that when they're building creative for your games or you're doing it itself, it fairly represents the game, because you want an honest CTR. Because if you don't do that, then it's a bit of a trick that happens. Publishers will build creative that kind of doesn't look anything like the game to get the installs, get the chart position. But what's going to be really poor is your LTV, because those users aren't going to stick around. So my point with showing these videos is, you know, try at this stage 3-5 different videos, because you're trying to catch the best CTR. And as I said, there's fail videos. You can have, you know, you versus your parent videos. You know, like that last example, a nice catchy sort of headline, encouraging headline, look how awesome this is. So play around with different creative formats. And then in terms of, well, what metrics should you aim for? How do I know if I've got a good idea? I think generally in the industry now, a sort of 4% CTR is a good standard. So to be clear, this is running on Facebook and this is running on iOS US. Now, each publisher will have a slightly different approach on Facebook. You can run on Facebook feed only, or you can run on Facebook feed, Instagram, and Fan, the Facebook audience network. And there's different reasons why you should and shouldn't run on those. But to really quickly summarize them, we do an aggregate of all three. And again, it comes back to demographics, right? Your Facebook feed, that has a certain, you know, demographic to it. You know, Instagram, typically good for more sort of ASMR games. You know, it's a slightly younger demographic. Fan, you're always going to get a higher CTR if you look at Fan, because the inventory is gaming inventory. So we take an aggregate, but never get excited if you see a 10% click-through rate on Fan, because that's actually fairly normal. Now, in terms of, you know, again, every developer or publisher will have their own model, but very roughly, if you've got a 4% CTR, that's roughly a 20-cent CPI on iOS US. So that's a really, really good starting point to validate your early core mechanic. But it's not just about CTR. That is part of the story. You also want to check your, you know, your CPC, right? Early on, you know, UA team will be thinking about, right, is this something we can also scale for UA purposes? So if you've got a 4% CTR and a CPC of around 10%, that's really interesting, right? The other point here, coming back to my earlier slide about the different genres of hypercasual, is, you know, for us at BoomBit, because we think about ARPU, it gives us a lot more flexibility to really look at the game and the genre. We don't have these set metrics for all games. If you don't hit them, then we're going to bin the game. So, for example, the CTR or CPI day one that we're going to look for from an action game, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be very different to what we need from an ASMR game, right? Because of the LTV on those games. You know, also, we're going to take a look at the charts, right? When you're testing this game, because, you know, if you've got a 4% CTR, that's really, really interesting. But as we go through the process, you need to keep an eye on those charts, because if you're seeing other games hitting those charts with a very similar mechanic, there's a good chance when you retest at CPI day one that CTR may have gone down, right? Because the Facebook algorithm is going to be seeing lots of very similar games. Your audience are going to be seeing similar games. So the demands on that game, the metrics are going to be higher because there's going to be other similar games in the charts. Where do you find inspiration for your games? I mean, this is great. This is what I love about Hypercasual. It's democratized game design, right? You could come up, anyone can come up with an idea for a game potentially, but generally, where do people get them from? You know, social media, TikTok, Instagram. There's a great account to follow here on Instagram, Storeglide, that, you know, posts every day 1, 2, 3 sort of, you know, games for you to get some inspiration from. YouTube, there's some fantastic channels. You know, I've put an example down here from itch.io, popular culture, Netflix, movies. You know, you can get ideas from anywhere. Museums, obviously, you know, now museums are not the easiest to access. And obviously hypercasual charts is the obvious one. Just look in the charts. What are the kind of mechanics that are regularly occurring in the top 20, 30, 50 games, right? Spend some time studying the charts. So once you've done that sort of initial CTR test, you've got your 4%, 5%, 9%, then we're going on to the CPI day one, where we're making a prototype, right? So general definition, a prototype, you know, for me personally, it doesn't really matter about the levels. It's more about, you know, the amount of gameplay, so 10 minutes of gameplay. But there is another way to look at it, where actually just build your first, you know, 1 to 4 levels and start there, because if you can't clear levels 1 to 4, there's no point building 20 levels. So what are we doing at CPI day one stage? Well, again, we are also retesting CTR to find the lowest CPI possible. We're going to be taking that core mechanic and we're going to be having an open mind. We're going to see if there's another theme, right, that we could apply it in. So if it's a sports game and we're seeing a borderline CTR, we may take the core mechanic and put it in a different setting, for argument's sake, right? Let's take the core mechanic of whatever sport it is and let's put it in an urban setting, let's put it in a beach setting, let's put it in a setting that would appeal to a much broader audience than just people that like a particular sport, right? So keep thinking about a game that has got a theme which is as broad a possible theme for your audience. Mixed mechanics, I'm going to share some examples of this. This is a big trend we're starting to see now, where developers, publishers are mixing up, you know, 2 different types of hyper-casual mechanics. UX, UI, it can make all the difference. And again, I'll talk about this later, but we're not trying to create, you know, art at prototype stage becomes more important, but it's the things like, you know, does a red character perform better than a purple character? Does a green bubble perform better than a purple bubble, for example? It's all these differences in color and backgrounds that can make a real difference in terms of your CTR performance. Look at your store conversion ratio as well. This is, you know, this is something that I think often gets missed. So what do I mean here? So what I'm talking about is sometimes users can click through to the App Store and be discouraged from downloading the game by something really minor and easily fixable. Like I said earlier, maybe the screenshots or the creative from the game are different to what they saw in the trailer. You know, maybe when you've created your assets for the store, the description for the game is not as exciting as it could be. And again, maybe it doesn't match the gameplay, for example. So have a look at that. And again, remember your target audience. Like sometimes when you see a really high CTR, that's because, again, put yourself in the audience shoes. You've basically built a game that's perhaps more like casual in theme or even mid-core in theme, that is naturally going to skew to a much smaller audience. And it's basic math. The smaller the appeal of your game, the higher the CPI. And the biggest piece of advice I can give is this, you know, print it out, put it on your studio wall, fail early, fail fast, fail often. Why? Because love it or hate it, hyper-casual, it's a volume game, right? It's about, you know, testing as many concepts as you can to find that catchy mechanic, to make a prototype. And just because you've made it to CPI day one stage you've got lots more hoops to make through before you even publish a game. And even when you publish a game, it's not guaranteed to be a global hit. You've got to be continually updating it. So if you have this mentality, if you park any thoughts or aspirations or any hint of ego, leave it outside the studio door. Just come in and be prepared to fail, because you're going to fail, but always learn, right? Make sure you're always getting feedback. Why did I fail? Why did I not get the CTR? What can I do better? So when you come back with your next attempt, you're coming on stronger. So let's have a look at a few tips and trends for game design. I have this conversation a lot. So what I mean by this is, have your own game thesis. Like, what do you believe in as a studio? So my advice is you should always have like three types of games or three pillars of games. So the first one is what you see a lot within Hypercasual is, okay, well, there's a game that's been a huge success, understand why it is, what ingredients you like, and can you do it better? Can you adapt the theme, right? Can you change some element of the game? And actually, when you analyze a lot of hyper-casual games, that's what they are, right? They're games from 2014, 2015, from last year. But someone's figured out something within that game that could improve it and enable them to scale the game. Blend mechanics. So I mentioned that earlier. Okay, well, look, I had a reasonably successful, let's say, car game before. What if I take that car game and I merge it with a drawing mechanic? Like, is that interesting? I can reuse some of my assets, but I can add on an extra mechanic. So I think it's really interesting to play around with these different mechanics. And from what we're seeing, these blended mechanic games have higher LTV. And your wild card, right? You must never lose that passion and that wonderment for hyper-casual games, just coming up with completely random ideas. And with the testing process I've put it through, just put it through the testing process. Just chuck together some videos and let players tell you if this completely random idea is interesting. But I think if you've got a nice blend of these ideas, however you manage your process, whether you're kind of regimental with game design documents, whether you're just spitting out CTR videos, I think if you've got this blend, it works really well. Now, as much as I love the creativity of hyper-casual games, there is no denying that a key ingredient of hyper-casual success is data, and I've said this many times. And game design is no different, right? I mentioned earlier, look at those sort of first 4 levels. If you can't guide a very large percentage of users through those first levels, there's no point really continuing with your game, because your retention is just going to decrease. So it's the kind of things you should be looking for that the data will tell you is, well, where are players dropping off in my game? You can identify the exact point in a level that users are not understanding your game and giving up. So what's the answer? Look at it, iterate it, fix it, and then rerun the test and see if your player churn at that specific point is going up. Again, level churn. At what point in the game are people dropping off? Where have you suddenly increased the difficulty level? Where have you introduced something new that people aren't understanding? And again, the same for player churn. And then when it comes to later levels, it does get a little bit tricky, right? Because this is where you've got to balance player churn, adding in maybe a new element of gameplay, a new mechanic that will enable you to do things like add in like a revive mode, for example, that is really important when it comes to like effective monetization. So, data-led game design is not something that is just specific to early stage testing. It's something that will remain constant through the whole publishing process. There's some basic elements as well of hyper-casual game design that you need to think about. So level 1 to 2, again, keep it really, really simple. This is where you need to teach the player the basic controls of the game, right? Level 1 should be the easiest it can possibly be. Sometimes you have a lot of conversations about game speed, decrease the game speed by 10%, 20%, 30%. If you can't get 99% plus of your players through level 1, then you may as well give up. So level 1 and 2 generally teach them the basic controls. then, you know, 3 to 10, it's all about a little bit of progression, right? It should still be really easy, but, you know, each level there should be adding, you know, something maybe slightly new, you know, an extra obstacle. Maybe you have to jump a bit higher, maybe you have to run a bit faster. You know, maybe I have to be a little bit quicker. But again, it should still be simple progression and feel great. And then, you know, once you've got players to level 10, that's when you can start adding in, you know, new obstacles, new mechanics. But every time you add in a new mechanic or new obstacle, think back to my rule for level 1 or 2, you still need to explain how to do that. You can't just add in a new mechanic or new obstacle and expect your players to figure it out. Because if you do, then what's going to happen is this, right? People are just going to drop off. So always remember, it's great to add more stuff into your game, but make sure that the players understand it. I couldn't really go through a presentation without some nod to Game of Thrones, given its popularity in the dev community. But again, game design, you know, monetization, it's not this dark art just for the UA team. It's really important from a game design experience. You understand ad monetization because it needs to feel a natural part of the game. You know, sadly, there's nothing you can get away from in terms of reviews. When you look at the App Store, there's too many banners in this game. But certainly when it comes to things like, you know, rewarded videos, you need to make sure it's a really, you know, natural value-added part of the game. And I'm going to just talk quickly about a couple of areas of innovation in this space that we're seeing. So again, it's got to directly make sense of the game. If you're just literally going to interrupt the game and put a rewarded video in, of course people are going to drop off because it's irritating, right? You know, imagine you're watching, you know, a TV program, and literally in the middle of the program, someone just puts an ad in. It feels completely unnatural. You're just going to change the channel. Same with hyper-casual games. Now, where rewarded videos are great, and here's an example here from Slapkings, is that it kind of naturally adds something to the game. So in Slapkings, you're playing the game, there's this nice tap and hold mechanic, but you get this offer to watch a video to get this, like, you know, super burning hand that can kind of finish off your enemy, which is really cool, right? It kind of makes sense for the game. You know, users will happily click on it, and it's great because you've now got an extra rewarded video into the game. You know, I mentioned earlier that as you go through the game, you can have, you know, like in action games, you can revive the character as that difficulty level may start to go up. And again, really great way to add monetization without making it feel like interrupting the game. Rather than dying and starting all over again, you can just revive your character just through watching an ad. Think about skins in games, you know, whether it's cars, characters, objects. You know, players love customizing their game experience, right? And that's how you do it in hyper-casual. You can allow them to skin just about anything. And the simple value exchange is to watch a rewarded video. Also seeing lots of rewarded mini games, rewarded missions. So kind of here's an example here that, you know, as you progress through a game and you kind of tick off certain missions you've completed, or like how many bosses that you've killed, you basically get extra rewards. Or again, another smart way is, as part of the game, you might actually have to the player, it looks just like a normal, you know, a normal progression, a normal part of the game. But actually what it is, you know, to access this, you know, special level, this special boss, they actually need to watch, you know, 1, 2, 3 rewarded videos. So again, it's a really nice way of increasing the monetization of your game, but directly linking it to the gameplay and letting the player think they have, you know, some extra special level that they've got access to. Now, again, data is not just about the game design process, it's also about A/B testing your ad creative. So, you know, it's just a quick example here about the way that, again, your audience will tell you what is going to be most effective creatively, so you can, you know, increase the metrics that are important to your game. So this is where, you know, UI, UX, and data analysts are super important to hyper-casual success, because it's zeroing in on data like this that can tell you the best type of ad creative that's going to drive the best metrics that you're aiming for your game. So, you know, is it a revive video versus more like a reward for completing a level video? All of these variables, you don't have to guess, you just test everything and your audience will tell you the answer. Now, in terms of some trends, there's a great example here from, you know, an amazing studio in Turkey, Suji Games, who are very strong at these multi-mechanic games, right? So rather than just a runner game that's you're just running the whole game, or a puzzle game where it's the same puzzle, what Suji have done in this game and other games is actually each level introduces a different kind of mechanic. So one level, you know, you can see here, is like an ASMR game, you know, just nice, simple tap and hold. The other game might be a puzzle game. You know, the next game is a skill-based game. So we're starting to see more and more of these games coming out now where developers, publishers are mashing up different styles and mechanics of hyper-casual games. And generally from what we're seeing, again, the LTV in these kind of games is a lot higher. But the key here, again, is to keep it really, really simple. We're not trying to build a casual game. Another kind of trend we're seeing is real world art style. So there's this theory that part of the challenge developers are experiencing when it comes to kind of CTR, CPI tests is that, you know, there are just so many ads out there that players are now seeing, and all the ads are starting to blur into one, right? It's the same purple character running along the same road that I've seen 100 times. So started to see some studios now actually taking almost like, you know, AAA or like mid-core graphics, but keeping the same sort of hyper-casual core looping gameplay. And we're seeing CTR tests produce higher results. And one reason for this is relatively simple, that you know, users they haven't seen this before. It looks interesting, it looks new. Yeah, I want to play this game. So this is an example from a really cool studio in Turkey, Backpack Games. You know, this is one of ours, and you'll notice this from our car games. We're very strong on these sort of real world art styles. So I'm not saying that every game that you make should have a real world art style. I think there's a clear type and style of game, and also it requires a certain you know, artist to be able to deliver this kind of game. But it's worth exploring if you're continually struggling with low CTR. You know, another example here from blending game mechanics. So you've got a really cool one from Voodoo Type Runner, where you've got a runner and skill typing as well. So, you know, typically an endless runner game, you just hold down and you keep running, maybe avoid objects. Here, the way that you run is actually defined by this typing game. So you type the words and your character runs along the screen. So that's a really interesting game. The other one is from Cappuccino Games in Turkey. And again, seeing quite a few of these games now where they're merging a drawing game with an action game. So again, sharing these to hopefully inspire you to look at the charts and see what sort of mechanics you can start to merge together into a really simple hyper-casual game. Get this question a lot, and I think it's really important for developers to think about you know, the publisher that they want to work with and the publishing deal they're looking for. And I think the reason I put these slides together is to help you create your own checklist of things that are important to you, because I feel sometimes really with developers, really all they want to know is, well, how much are you going to pay me and what's rev share? And for me, that's such a small part of the publishing conversation and success. So a few things to think about. Well, what deal type do you want? You know, do you want an exclusive deal, i.e. you are signed exclusively to that studio and you can't work with any other studio? Now, clearly there's some benefits to that. You get to understand the publisher's processes, the way they think. You know, a possible downside is that, well, if they're continually rejecting your games, well, you're unable to take those games and test with another publisher who may have a different approach, different benchmarks, and may be able to make that game a success. So decide on the type of relationship you want, an exclusive or non-exclusive. You know, really, I can't decide this for you, but it's a balance of risk depending on, you know, the life stage of your studio, your overheads, what you want to achieve, the direction you want to go in, but it is a balance of risk in terms of the commercial terms and what you're willing to agree to versus the outcome. I mean, clearly, you know, the advantage of an exclusive deal is you may be able to kind of get better terms. You may be able to negotiate a slightly longer notice period, so you can't just get dumped at a month's notice and then all of a sudden you've got to find a new contract to cover your overheads. As I said, it's not just about the money, right? Success in Hypercasual is about technology, it's about automation, and it's about people that are experienced in hypercasual games, that understand level design, that understand game design, that understand how to read data to turn, you know, your interesting sort of CTR test that got 4% into an actual prototype that's got interesting CPI day 1, day 7 metrics that then passes the monetization test. So just because someone's throwing money at you, that does not mean they're going to deliver success. So think about the gaps in your own team, maybe resource or knowledge that you need, and make sure a publisher can provide that. I know it sounds obvious, but always read the contract and know what you're signing up for. If you've got access to a lawyer, third-party legal support, it's well worth taking that up just to have a read, because there's all sorts of sort of clauses in there that, you know, you'll just kind of read through because you're really excited to get the deal and you get your X amount per prototype. But really read the contract and keep an eye for any clauses around ownership of IP, you know, cancellation periods. And really my next point, which is really key, which is be really clear on the definitions of everything a publisher says. So, well, how do they define a prototype? Because every publisher may have a different version of that. Well, what are the benchmarks? Like what do I need to get in CTR, right? What do I need to get for CPI day 1? When you say you'll accept a game and therefore pay me for a prototype, well, what does that actually mean? You know, well, okay, well, just because I've now hit these benchmarks on Facebook, are there any other platforms and benchmarks that I have to hit to be able to publish a game? So, you know, as in any business transaction, make sure you agreed on the key terms. And I've tried to put together some top questions to ask a publisher to really figure out if they're a good match for you and your team. So this first one for me is really important. As Hypercasual matures and gets more competitive, you need a publishing manager that's actually got experience making games, right? Because otherwise you could have a great account manager, but all they're going to do is basically take your CTR video, take your prototype, put it in Slack, and then wait for feedback from, you know, the design team, from a level designer, from the creative team, and it just slows down the whole process. So, you know, for me, that's actually relatively important. You know, you want to be working with someone that actually understands, you know, hyper-casual games and can add value to you. Second question is going to be, well, you know, how many studios are you looking after, right? Again, the hyper-casual model is built on volume, right? So publishers have got 50, 100, 200 studios signed up. That's just the way most publishers work in terms of the volume. Just test as many games as possible. Doesn't matter which studio it comes from. I just need to get my 1, 2, 3 games out a month. So as long as you're fine with that model and go into it with your eyes open, but if really what you're looking for is expertise and knowledge and someone that's going to spend time with you, have weekly calls, the question you need to think is, well, if my publishing manager is also looking after 10 other studios that are submitting 3, 4 games a month, that's 40 games per month for one person. Am I really going to get that expertise? I referenced earlier, so, you know, really what's more important to the publisher? Is it like chart position, revenue, or is it profit? Because they're not the same thing. So to explain this really simply, anyone can boost a game, spend UA money, and get to the top of the charts. The simple reality is it's highly unlikely you're making money. You're probably losing money. Now, why a publisher would do this? Because it's the best advertising for a game, right? As a developer, you go to the charts, you see who's in the top charts, you think they must be great, so I send them my game, right? What you need to be thinking about is actually that balance between chart position and profitability, because, you know, we all want to make hit games, but we all also like to get paid and have the financial freedom to make whatever decisions we want. And the way you do that is by getting a profitable hit game. And that what you want to make sure is that all of your hard-earned game profit is not being reinvested for not your benefit, but the publisher's benefit, again, to sustain chart position. So actually being in the top 10, I know it's a great thing. You can tell everyone you're top 10, but actually it's not great in terms of game margins and profitability. Where do you stand on copying games? I think there's a big difference between a blatant copy of a game, which, you know, I think all the developer community agree is sort of ethically unacceptable, versus actually just taking a game and improving it. There is a big difference. And the last question, really key, well, if you reject my game because it doesn't meet your metric, can I take it to another publisher? Because I think once you start talking to different publishers, you will understand some of the things I'm telling you and seeing the completely different approaches. And, you know, I've seen it many times where people bring us games that have been rejected, and actually it's a perfectly publishable game. It's just for that publisher based on the type of game they're looking for. You know, maybe they're just looking for simulation games. It didn't work for them. So just to finish off, like where next for hyper-casual games? So I don't have all the answers, but I think this first point is, on the one hand, incredibly exciting and a great validation for, you know, the publishing and the development community in hyper-casual, that we're seeing some really big M&A activity. You know, the investment in Voodoo from Tencent, the Zynga acquisition of Rollic. We're seeing a number of investments into hyper-casual studios. You know, of course, there is a practical industry reason that a lot of people are talking about around iOS 14, but, you know, don't underestimate the skills these studios and publishers have for UA and monetization, and this just great hacking mentality to build tech that maybe some of these legacy gaming studios don't have. And I think there's a lot they know they can learn from hyper-casual. A reality at the developer level is, of course, as you have more developers building games, there are now more publishers, there is more competition. And the reason I put this game analytics chart in is for the simple reason that it is getting harder and harder now to hit the CPI or day 1 or day 7 you need to hit to publish a game. And, you know, personally, I believe that trend is going to continue, because it's just simply about supply and demand. There are just so many new games hitting the store, new developers. So what do I think a potential solution to that is? Well, I don't think the answer is going to be copying Archery and a whole host of hybrid casual games. You know, for me, Archery was you know, immensely successful, and I've seen a whole raft of copycats that have never scaled to anywhere near Archery. So I think if that's your goal and you think hybrid casual is going to be about building another Archery, then you're going to fail. But I think this model, if you pick apart the game, is interesting, and I think does give a glimpse of where you can take this hyper casual audience. So this hyper casual audience who've been playing these games for, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 years, they're not going to suddenly jump to, you know, a match 3 game, an RPG game, but they are looking for, you know, a game that maybe gets a little bit more deeper now in terms of gameplay. And well, where do they go to find that? The answer right now is not a lot of places. You know, there are some studios and developers, publishers playing around with a hybrid casual model, but I think the key ingredients are, if you can keep the theme and the art style recognizable for that hyper casual audience, you can have that addictive sort of core loop that you get in hyper casual to drive retention. But I think it's learning from, you know, what Archery did from RPG to having that deeper meta to a game, you know, the deeper in-game economy and reward system that doesn't scare the hyper casual audience, but it really starts to bring them into the game, that enables you to monetize more effectively than relying on ads. So for me, generally, in terms of monetization, rule of thumb is that hybrid casual games should have at least 30, if not 40% IEP in. Now, from a developer's perspective, if you are thinking about going down this route, you know, again, coming back to my previous point about thinking about the partner you need to find for this to succeed, you're going to need a team that have got experience in IEP-based games, right? You're going to need a team that understand live ops. So I'm not talking about live ops for mid-core games, but, you know, imagine you're playing a nice hyper-casual game and in a really soft way without knowing it, all of a sudden you're part of this really cool like live event with this live content linked to a cultural moment, you know, whether it's Chinese New Year or Valentine's Day or Christmas, right? It's a really neat idea that we see increasing. You know, we've been testing it in some of our hyper casual games. It does increase retention, but you know, suddenly spinning up a live ops team is not something you know, perhaps an existing hyper casual publisher can do. So if you are looking down this route, you know, understand this game genre and the mechanics that are going to be required to succeed, and go find a partner that can actually help you explore this. This is a great slide from a really cool studio in the UK, from Fun Games, who have created this notion of hyper idol. So back to what I just said, you've got this hyper casual audience now that are looking for more and not sure what it looks like. Well, you know, Fun came up with this concept of hyper idol that is the, you know, the CPI of a hyper casual game, but the LTV of an idle game. So we've started to see some really cool hyper idle games now hit the charts that again take all the things that we love about hyper casual, but bring in a little bit more of the idle gameplay, the addictiveness, and that's driving the higher LTV. But as you can see here, this is a great representation of really when you think about commercial success, you know, bottom left, ultra casual, as I started off saying, low CPI, low LTV, hyper casual, again, mass scale, LTV is varied. And I think this is why, you know, hybrid casual, hyper idle are going to start to get more interesting, because with this increased competition and margins being squeezed commercially and from a gameplay perspective, we need to start looking at this sort of greenfield area where there isn't perhaps as much competition as hyper casual. You know, I'm sure some of you listening now feel this. It is tiring working in hyper casual. I'm not saying that to put you off it. It's just a reality, right? The number of prototypes and CTR videos your team are going to work through, you know, keeping your team going and focused on your goals is really important. But one thing I am now seeing from this trend is that, you know, I talk to studio heads a lot, and it is this trade-off, right? It's hyper casual, it's just a volume CTR video game test approach that hyper casual has been built on. But you just feel this desire that at times they just want to get back to making games, right? And that's kind of been lost. So what I'm starting to see now as a result of this sort of like this feeling and burnout is new publishing models. Developers are starting to explore, well, how else can I build my studio and take greater control of the development process, greater control of the metrics, get more transparency in terms of what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. So as I said, on here, the kind of publisher burn and churn, it is what it is, right? If you want to succeed in hyper casual, it's a volume game, just get comfortable with it, it works. And the reality is there's maybe a 1% to 2% chance that you may ever have a hyper casual hit. So, you know, if that approach is not appealing to you, well, what other options do I have? Well, there's now this hybrid model, right? I'm starting to see studios that do work with publishers non-exclusively, but are starting to build up their own UA and monetization expertise. And they're starting to actually build some small games in-house that they don't send to publishers, that they're just figuring out, you know, how do I use, you know, mediation? How do I use Iron Source, Max, Mopub, for example? You know, how do I start scaling campaigns on, you know, Facebook, on TikTok, on Snap, for argument's sake? And now there's some really interesting funding models as well. These platforms where they would just lend you money directly linked to your ROAS, so you don't have to go and raise all this VC money or angel money. So that's an interesting approach. And really the final one is self-publishing. You know, we've seen this from 2 or 3 studios this year that have successfully raised funds where they've worked with a publisher, they learn as much as they can about game design, creative, UA monetization, they get a hit and they use that money to then go and raise money, because as you've had a hit, it validates your process. You can now raise money that then funds your next wave of growth in terms of your UA team. You've got money to then fund your UA. So I'm starting to see this more and more now, and you know, I love hearing this hunger and passion from studio CEOs, studio heads that want to build their own games business, right? So I think this is a real possibility now. If you listen to everything that I've been trying to share with you and are focused on process, focused on data, focused on trends, actually building out your own studio where you're in complete control of metrics. And don't forget, once you remove a publisher from this conversation, well, you're not giving away, 50%, 60%, 70%, rev share. And that means actually you can publish a very profitable game with, I think you'll be quite surprised at the metrics versus perhaps what some publishers quote you in terms of like day 140, day 150. So for me as a developer, like HyperCasual is as exciting as ever. It's evolving as much on the gameplay, game design side as it is on the commercial side. So I hope some of that has been useful. There's lots of different schools of thought on HyperCasual. This is just one. This is just my view on what's happening. And feel free to reach me on Skype, email if there's anything you want to discuss in more detail. And I wish all of you listening the best of luck, and I look forward to seeing all of your games. And thanks for tuning in. Take care.